And happy to be joined now by Ricky Matthews, host of the Ricky Matthews Show on SuperTalk Mississippi and also SuperTalk Outdoors. So he's got his hands and his mind in a lot of different places. Ricky, good to see you. Good to visit with you. I'd love for us to jump in because you wrote an opinion piece on Medicaid expansion. It has been a topic for a long time. The previous administration was adamantly against going down this road. There's been a bit of a softening on this stance. Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann has indicated that he would like to do something, did that leading up to the election. It was a huge topic of conversation for Democrat gubernatorial candidate Brandon Presley. It was his biggest platform piece. And it continues to be with this 2024 legislative body in Jackson. But it is not a simple issue by any stretch of the imagination.
No, but what my opinion piece said was I congratulated Delbert Hosemann for having, for pushing this forward and creating an opportunity for us to have this conversation. And then now the speaker is going to be part of that conversation. I think it helps to have a lieutenant governor who was a tax lawyer. He understands the numbers extraordinarily well. And to have a speaker from a rural area, he's experienced it. He has family members and friends and sees what happens for, 51% of Mississippians live in rural areas. We've got to have the conversation. What's happened in Mississippi over the past several years is we shut it down for political reasons. And we haven't dealt with the reality that we have a crisis in Mississippi, a healthcare crisis. You go to any rural area, and I would say, look, there are a lot of pundits out there and conservative think tanks and some nonprofit news organizations that are shielding for big money contributors and all this stuff. The reality is they're pushing hard to shut the door on this and draw political lines before we even have the debate in Mississippi. It's time to open it up. It's time to have a conversation. And let's see what is possible in Mississippi. The way I talked about it in my column, incidentally, Richard, was it's like a hurricane has hit the healthcare sector in Mississippi. And what did we do after Hurricane Katrina? We looked to ourselves and the federal government and the state. We all came together and we solved the problem. And we rebuilt coastal Mississippi and Mississippi for that matter. But in this case, we've got to do the same thing. And listen, by the way, just about every state's expanded right now. So Mississippi's supplementing the rest of the country right now. So that's something we need to put on the table. And one other point of clarification, I'm actually told that the feds did sue Georgia. Georgia won, and the feds did not appeal. So I would assume that we're going to get clarity about that as we go forward. Yeah,
maybe so. I had read a story that said that was still pending litigation. So we'll see. I mean, depending on which way the wind blows on a different day, they always could come back and sue on that. You bring up an interesting point in that, and I said this a second ago, is that don't make it like, okay, if the federal government is supplementing the cost of expanded Medicaid in Mississippi, ultimately we are all paying for this because we are tax-paying citizens. But the dirty little secret is what you just said a second ago. Because we're paying federal taxes, we're paying for it anyway. So is taking advantage of it for our citizens in Mississippi, does that not make some sense?
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's something we really need to get our heads around. You know what I think? I think that at the end of the day, we all ought to step back. And I hate it that there are those who are out there drawing political lines for conservatives in the legislature who are going to be, forced to think, if you're on this side of the line, you're not conservative anymore. And you're on this side of the line, you are conservative. And we haven't even had the debate yet. We need to have a thoughtful, educated conversation about what this means for Mississippi. And, in addition to that, incidentally, I think we have to have a very serious conversation about sort of re-engineering the healthcare system in Mississippi as it is, because as you think about hospitals closing and pulling back services, we need to change the relationship that exists between these rural hospitals and rural healthcare providers and trauma centers and and figure that out. But at the end of the day, man, I had the CEO, Lawrence St. Pei from Singing River Health Systems on last week. And he said, last year they had $30 million in uncompensated care. Business can't operate that way. And this would help fill that gap.
Sure. It certainly is an issue with levels of complication. I like the idea of the must be working carve out. And, Lance and I were talking about it a little bit. There's this, I'm going to use the word sweet spot, but it's anything but a sweet spot for earners, people who are working, who are getting up and going to work and doing their best to try to make ends meet, that are making between $20,000 and $40,000 a year, which is it's the poverty level with where we are today. We had a texter that said, I'm 60 and nobody helped my generation when we were making $20,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $60,000 a year. And I understand that in the early 80s, interest rates were out of control and it was really, really hard. But there is a part of me, I feel like you want to help people who are willing to help themselves. And for the folks who are getting up and they are working and they're doing the best they can, saying, hey, here's a helping hand, a piece of encouragement, I don't see that as the worst solution.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you, man. Hey, you made a good point a minute ago, and that is that over the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen major changes in the way people are insured. As a former CEO, I was a CEO for 16 years, retired in 2016. And I watched other CEOs and I watched small business owners wrestle with the issues of insurance. And what we see is people not getting insured more. We see them getting insured less. And so the reality around the working poor in Mississippi is very significant. And we've really got to get our head around it. And Gerard also made a good point yesterday about, the issue around healthcare in Mississippi. You got, again, about 3 million people in Mississippi. 670,000 Mississippians are food insecure in this state, and 200,000 of those are kids. And this is where a lot of the sweet spot for how we need to have this conversation. This is where it resides for sure. And a lot of these folks are working poor people in this state.
Yeah. We get a message that says, I raised 5 kids on less than $40,000 a year. I had no help, so I got another job. Just saying. And God bless you for it. God bless you for it. You worked your rear end off, and I hope those 5 kids understand what you did in terms of sacrificing for them every single day. There's some people that can't do what you did. There's some people that won't do what you did. But that also doesn't change kind of how I feel about I go back to what we said a second ago. Somebody that's trying, I want to help out. Think of it. You may have had this happen to you before, Ricky. You see somebody on the street who's begging, right? They need money for food. I was in South Florida one time, and it just kind of struck me. And I told my wife, Jane, and I were there, and it was right next to a McDonald's. I was like, hey, let's walk in here for a second. And I went in and bought like a Big Mac meal with a soft drink. And I took it out and I handed it to it. And this woman looked at me like I had 3 heads. I said, I thought you were hungry. She janked it out of my hand, shoved it in her bag, and said, get out of here. And I was like, okay, that's the game we're playing. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who's genuinely hungry that's trying to get something to eat, figuratively.
Yeah. Hey, well, listen, I admire that note that you got from that woman as well. I really do. I mean, people who have found a way to deal with it from inside their family by working more and finding insurance, et cetera. But the reality is, when you think about the amount of uncompensated care in a state where 51% of the people live in rural areas, it's not okay. So there may be people in those rural areas that are doing what she did. Okay, I think that's great. But the problem is that the level of care that exists in those areas is going down fast. Hospitals are closing and so on. So, this is more than just what she's talking about. There's another side to this that says, even if you did that, you can't get the care you need. And so I've watched people I know die in the Mississippi Delta because they couldn't get they couldn't get the services they need, man. And if I'm at my hunting camp in the Mississippi Delta and I have a severe critical situation in my family, I'm seriously concerned about where we're going to get that care and how we're going to get it. This is what we need. This is the debate and the conversation and the education we need to get in this state, and we should not shut down the conversation just because we've always said no.
395. Healthcare in Mississippi is super complicated. I mean, you could stop right there. They go on to say even private insurance, Blue Cross Blue Shield, reimburses less in Mississippi than in neighboring states. Yes, it is complicated, and it's probably the reason, maybe the biggest reason, that it's important for us to talk about it and make sure that we are at least having the conversation. I like the way you put that, Ricky. Let's at least have the debate. Let's at least talk about it and put it out there and make sure everybody's looking at all the sides of this. I want to ask you about two more things before our time runs out. Number one, I feel like on an annual basis, the two biggest issues in Jackson that we're dealing with at the legislative level are health care and education. And that seems to be a thing over and over and over and over and over. This conversation about either eliminating or completely recalibrating MAEP and the way that public schools are funded in Mississippi is a fascinating one to me. On the House side, there is some discussion about making that go away and putting together a complete new funding model. We have seen strides and progress in K through 12 education in Mississippi. You have any, and I'm kind of throwing this at you, just any big picture thoughts on this conversation?
Listen, I think most people will conclude that the fastest way to get Mississippi to a place where we need to be, both for our citizens and for economic development and for quality of life, is we can focus on education. I think broadband access was a huge step in that direction. I've never seen so much fiber optic cable laid as I watched get laid in the Mississippi Delta. Unbelievable. Being able to provide high-speed internet access to families that would have never had it before. Huge step in the right direction. I think the notion of
but Ricky, forgive me for interrupting. It's not just in rural Mississippi. Obviously, it's incredibly important in rural Mississippi. I live 2.5 minutes from the Ole Miss campus. I am 3 years into having a fiber optic cable from C-Spire run through my front yard into this office and powering this broadcast this morning. 3 years ago, it was like 14 megabit or something. And now I've got a gigabit fiber cable. So, yes, it felt like it was going to be impossible a few years ago. But it's not just rural. It's everybody. It's connecting the whole state.
It is. I think that's a really good point. Same with me. Big high-speed cable coming into this computer that I'm on now. But I think, that was a transformative move. And then you add to that this notion around the third grade reading level and getting that focused on. And, I mean, look, you go back and look at the numbers over the past 10 years. It's dramatic what kind of impact that's had on the state. I think the focus on public school system is an important one. Whether it happens through changing the formula that you discussed, or whether it happens through raising a very significant discussion in this state about school choice, because I think parents became much more aware of how good their school system is based on how their school system responded to the pandemic, and some liked what they saw and some hated what they saw. Mm-hmm. And so the reality now is parents want more control than they had before. So, it would be interesting. I think education in general is going to be a gigantic conversation in this legislative session, because I think there are a lot of legislators ready to take big steps toward improving education in the state, whether it's done through private schools or through public school. One way or the other, we're going to get there. I think that's what's behind some of this.
There's one thing, and by the way, how important is this topic? There are seats in the Mississippi House and Senate that have been won and lost by significant legislators simply based on MAEP funding and votes around it. I know that for a fact. The one thing that concerns me, I'm fortunate, Ricky, in that public schools in Lafayette County are really good, both at the Oxford School District and the Lafayette County School District. Very, very fortunate. I don't want to see a funding conversation that punishes successful school districts simply to prop up underperforming school districts, when sometimes part of the reason districts are underperforming is because of mismanagement as opposed to not actually having enough.
No, I agree, actually. Listen, when I was publisher of the Sun Herald, Haley Barber came to an editorial board meeting once. And he came many times, but he came and he said, I just left a school district in a poor part of the state, and their school scores were off the charts. So leadership makes a huge difference.
It absolutely matters. I'm sorry we ran out of time before we talked turkeys.